The Arctic is home to unique and irreplaceable terrestrial and marine habitats, including the tundra, the mountains, the wetlands, shallow marine shelves, and it's home to tens of thousands of highly adapted species. And they include some of our most iconic species, such as the polar bear, the narwhal, the Arctic fox, and many of those play really central roles in the indigenous cultures of the North as well. And that's not to mention all the microorganisms and the smaller organisms that are crucial in ecosystem functioning, which we've hardly begun to describe. The Arctic is suffering some of the most significant temperature changes anywhere on the planet. And the warmer waters are leading to changes in the compositions in the plankton communities, which in turn impacts on the higher trophic tiers. Northward shifts in species range have already been described, and where that's for a terrestrial species, that reduces the habitat reserved for the species of the high Arctic. Marine species are suffering from multi-year loss of sea ice, as well as from distributional changes of the prey populations. And there are also physical chemical changes. The melting sea ice can lead to changes in the salinity. It can affect the niche conditions of the unique ecosystems of the Arctic. And the Arctic waters are also particularly prone to acidification due to the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which threatens anything with a shell. In addition to those climate impacts, pollution is also a concern in the Arctic. And although the Arctic is one of our most pristine environments, it's also one of the most fragile. Oil spills from development sites and pipelines pose a serious threat, in particular in marine environments where it's all but impossible to contain them or to clean them up. And as the decline of the sea ice enables further exploration for fossil fuels, there's a risk of further pollution and habitat destruction that might follow that. And the associated noise pollution and increased shipping activity further add to the pressures. But other aquatic pollutants are also reaching this remote area and its inhabitants, including some legacy contaminants, but also some compounds of emerging concerns, such as pharmaceutical residues, microplastics, and various persistent organic pollutants, old and new. And some of those, through process of biomagnification, pose a particular risk to top predators. And air pollution also affects the Arctic. Some long-range air pollutants from Eurasia, but also local emissions from shipping, from drilling rigs, and sadly also from the nearby boreal forest fires are important sources. And as it was mentioned this morning already, black carbon is particularly problematic as it can affect climate processes by reducing the albedo effect. But all kinds of pollutants can impact directly on Arctic biodiversity as well, and may also have health impacts for the local residents, either through direct inhalation or through deposition on land and subsequent entering into the food chain. So there is a greater urgent need to understand biodiversity better in more detail, to understand how it's affected by environmental pollution and also how that interacts with the climate change impacts for organisms and people in these extreme and changing conditions. Ecosystems and biodiversity underpin all aspects of our lives, but they've also got an intrinsic value. And Indigenous peoples often have the closest relationships with our natural systems and are amongst the strongest advocates. And for many people, the concept of climate justice extends to non-humans as well as to all peoples. And perhaps that is nowhere better illustrated than in the Arctic, one of the last remaining great wildernesses. So in order to ensure that those get the protection they deserve, it's vital that we take an interdisciplinary perspective and that we work in partnership to share that knowledge and expertise to inform decision making. So we really hope that this event will contribute to this knowledge exchange in itself, and also to help strengthen the networks through which we can collaborate to strengthen our institutions and to strengthen the protections that we have. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Goodwin from the University of Aberdeen. Thank you. Sarah, are you there?
Yes.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And you can see my screen?
We can. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's nice to be with you all this afternoon. Look forward to chatting at the end of the session. So I just want to give you a very short research nugget, I guess, of some work we've been doing in the Arctic. And this is about the effect of nitrogen on tundra ecosystem carbon storage. And this particular bit of work was done by Lorna Street in a long-term experiment that I had run with many others. So just to give you a bit of context, tundra soils contain arguably about 40% of the global soil terrestrial carbon stocks. And those are a large part of the whole terrestrial carbon stock. So obviously the fate of that carbon is very important for climate change. And it's generally agreed that tundra is nitrogen limited. That's the growth of the vegetation is limited by the amount of nitrogen available, or sometimes it's co-limited by both nitrogen and phosphorus. And as has already been mentioned, nitrogen availability in the tundra may increase due to a number of reasons, but mostly increased resource exploitation and industry in the Arctic, with increased shipping, with the loss of sea ice. Also increased precipitation in the high Arctic, which carries the pollutants down to the ground. And of course, with warming, we may get warmer soil and faster rates of mineralization, which would make more nitrogen available to plants. And that last mechanism may also operate for phosphorus too. And it's generally agreed that in temperate systems, increased nitrogen availability within ecosystems can increase carbon sequestration. And work on this has mostly come from temperate forests. So what we wanted to ask is, how does increased nitrogen input affect carbon sequestration in the tundra, which is a very different system from a temperate forest and is much more nutrient limited? And also, how is that response of ecosystem carbon to nitrogen input affected by phosphorus availability? So our research was done at Ny-Ålesund on Svalbard, as shown in this photo, on a beautiful day. And this started out as a project on the effects of atmospheric nitrogen deposition, i.e. nitrogen as a pollutant, on high Arctic heat. And this was in the days when we were concerned about acid rain, probably as much as we were concerned about climate change. And it was a NERC special topic project, one of the first special topic that NERC funded in the Arctic. And although we had our own individual project, there were folk from about 6 different universities, I think, all working on their own projects, but on the same bit of tundra and from the same research station, and the collaboration between us was very important. So we ran an experiment on a cassiope heath, that's a white bell heather heath, which we treated just for 3 years, from 1991 to 93. And we had control plots, obviously, and nitrogen treatment in factorial combination with a phosphorus treatment, which we watered onto the tundra using very high-tech green plastic watering cans. So that was 91 to 93. And Steve Coulson was part of one of the other projects working there at the same time on the NERC special topic. And in 2008, he took a wander across the tundra in the same area that we'd done our projects, and he recognized my plots. It has to be said that during our first 3 years of funding, very little happened, and all Arctic ecological funding really should be much more than 3 years, because stuff is slow, isn't it, out there? So we saw very little in 3 years, but 15 years later, our plots were very visible on the tundra, and there are obviously big effects of those treatments that we had put on for 3 years. So in 2011, we managed to get some more money, and this is when Lorna went and visited the plots and did some work on carbon sequestration, so the effects of our nutrient treatments on the carbon stocks in the ecosystem. Now, Lorna chopped out the whole ecosystem, which you can do when it's as tiny as it is on Svalbard, in these 10-centimeter square chunks. And basically what you have here is the live plants at the top of the turf, Most of the vegetation is actually moss, and moss is growing at the top, so assimilating carbon into the system, and it's decomposing at the bottom and forming the organic soil layer, and which is also decomposing, and the decomposition is releasing carbon from the system. So that's a whole ecosystem sample. And what Lorna observed was very easily seen by eye, was that where we'd applied both nitrogen and phosphorus to the system, the layer of vegetation and the layer of organic matter was much deeper. And where we had applied nitrogen, it was shockingly very much thinner. So remember, these treatments were put on for 3 years, 2 decades before Lorna came and chopped up our plots. So we chopped up those turfs and measured the carbon in each of the components. So this is the total carbon stock in the vegetation and soil organic layer. And the white bar is the control, the blue bar is phosphorus, the pink bar is the plots we'd added nitrogen to, and the red bar is the plots we'd added both nitrogen and phosphorus to. And you can see that where we had added nitrogen to the tundra for 3 years, 2 decades earlier, 44% of the carbon had been lost from the system. But where we'd added nitrogen and phosphorus, an additional 56% had been gained. So we thought a lot about how this had operated over that period of time from such a short period of treatment at the outset. And what we kind of elucidated was that the nitrogen had increased decomposition rates. And where decomposition is faster, the resulting depth of the moss layer and depth of the soil organic layer is thinner because they've decomposed. And the result is a loss of carbon. But where we'd added nitrogen and phosphorus together, the first effect had been that it had increased the moss growth, and it had also changed the tissue chemistry such that decomposition had been slowed. And where decomposition is slower, the end result is that you end up with a thicker moss layer and a thicker soil organic layer. And also the moss growth itself obviously will contribute to the thickness of the moss layer. And the net result of that is that the carbon store in the system is increasing over time. There was one more really interesting feature, which is that the thickness of the moss layer controls the temperature of the bottom of the moss layer and the soil layer where the decomposition is happening. So this is how the system has perpetuated either the loss or gain of carbon, because where the moss layer is thinner, the soil and the bottom of the moss layer is warmer during summer, and so the rate of decomposition is faster, which of course results in the moss layer being thinner and the soil organic layer being thinner, which results in the temperature being a bit higher, which results in the decomposition being faster. And so the system perpetuates this loss of carbon. Whereas when the moss layer is thicker, then the temperature at the bottom of the moss layer and then the soil organic layer is lower in the active season. And so the rate of decomposition is slower. And the slower the decomposition, then the thicker the moss layer accumulates and the thicker the soil organic layer accumulates, and therefore the lower the temperature is. And so that cycles around and perpetuates the gain of carbon in the system. So what we concluded is, if in the tundra, if phosphorus is limiting, then if there is increased nitrogen deposition from atmospheric pollution or whatever source, then that will result in carbon loss from these important carbon stores. Whereas if soil warming increases phosphorus availability through increased mineralization, then increased nitrogen could result in carbon gain. So it all depends on the amount of phosphorus that's around. And also the key thing is that these effects are mediated by the moss layer, and the moss layer is hugely important in all Arctic and peatland ecosystems. And so because this mechanism is effectively an effect of the moss layer, the same mechanisms may occur much more widely at high latitudes. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was really fascinating, and the complexity and the interactions between the changing climate and the pollution are particularly interesting, I think, and really important to understand. lots of questions really, but we don't have time just now. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kim Lass, there's the Senior Lecturer in Marine Biology and Chronobiology, who will give us the second presentation of today. Kim.
Hello, yes, thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that was a fascinating talk. I'll have to stop getting the moss out of my lawn then, of which we have a lot here on the West Coast. Going to Svalbard actually here now in the winter is what my talk is going to focus on, and likewise I'm going to just give you a little nugget of some of the research that we're doing at the moment. This is a collaboration between SAMS and the University of Tromsø, and the project is called Deep Impact, and it's being led by Jürgen Berger, but it's a multinational project looking at the impact of light in the Arctic. So this really, oops, sorry. So just to give you a very broad overview to start with, what is the influence of light pollution? And if you look around in the literature, it's quite overwhelming, really. Greater than 80% of the world lives under light polluted skies, and about a quarter of that experiences light pollution at night on the Earth's surface. And a third of humanity cannot even see the Milky Way. And I guess what's even more concerning and worrying is that the increase in light pollution is between 3 and 6% per year. So as scientists, we always ask the question, so what? Again, there is a lot of literature out there which talks about the effects of light pollution. Light is not only a source of energy for the planet, it is also crucially a source of information. And with many of you working on organisms that measure day length, you will understand the importance of that. So organisms use light to determine when they sleep, hunt, hide, migrate, and any disruption of this pattern causes a disruption in those major physiological and biological processes. And so we could ask then, well, what about the Arctic? How does this fit into the story of light pollution? And the Arctic in many ways is a very, very special place. At very high latitudes, we have got very extreme photoperiods. So much so that if you stand on the North Pole, you only have one day and one night per year. But anything within the Arctic Circle has between 1 day and up to 6 months of the year of darkness. And so whilst most of us go to the Arctic during the summer, we need to focus on the winter months to understand what the effects of light pollution may be. So what light is there in the Arctic? Well, you've got the main lights, which are moonlight and sunlight, but you've also got the northern lights and starlight. And we know that moonlight and sunlight particularly are extremely important in structuring the phenology and the timing of marine organisms. And here's a picture of a krill, which is a very important constituent of the Arctic marine ecosystem. And we know that it's got 2 orders of magnitude greater light sensitivity during the polar night than any terrestrial equivalent. But unfortunately, these light sources are very, very dim. And so most commercial sensors don't really work in terms of quantifying this light. And so with Norwegian partners, the University of Tromsø, NTNU, and SAMS have built a light observatory in Hyalysand, and that's been running for about 3 or 4 years now. And that allows us to quantify not only the radiance, the amount of light, but also the spectral composition of light. And you can see from this figure up here that during December and January, those bumps along the bottom are the moonlight. So moonlight becomes incredibly important at this time of year. And the take-home message here really is that we are dealing with incredibly small levels of light structuring the marine ecosystem at this time. But as we've also heard in the introduction, the Arctic is opening. There are some predictions that the Arctic will be ice-free by 2050. And because of this, trade routes are opening. So resource exploitation and new faster trade routes between the Atlantic states and the Far East will pour light into this environment. And everybody's very interested in this. It's so much so that the government is publishing various reports on this, and it's actually been likened, I just read recently, to the polar Silk Road. Okay, so after that preamble, how do you quantify this? Well, like scientists, we like to ask specific questions that we can answer. So if we've got a light source, what is the response time of organisms to that light source? What's the impact, the area of that light source? What's the depth of impact? And is there a research sampling bias in the literature from surveys which have been done during the polar night using light? So our choice, our tool is acoustics, and fancy modern new acoustics is able to discriminate between different size classes of organisms. And the next couple of slides with data that I'm going to show you were generated by Maxime Joffre and Tom Langban, and they really show the dramatic implications of putting light into the marine environment. So this was a study taken last year, 2020, in Billefjord, which is in Svalbard. So this is during January. What you can see there on the right is the research ship, very well lit, and a lead in the ice. And so what we did was we turned the ship's light on and off, and what you can see up here on the left is just a 2-hour window of the lights being turned on and off on the ship. And these two frequencies represent fish on the left at 38 kilohertz and at 120 kilohertz, or the smaller stuff, the zooplankton. And I won't go into detail here, except to say that what you can see is that when the lights are on, there is a very, very rapid decrease in those organisms in response to that light. And what you can also do is you can use fancy lights, underwater lights that you attach to CTD or just a wire. You lower them down and you measure the response of organisms to that. And what we can see here on the right is the ship's lights, which are both on and off, and the response away from the light source at the different types of lights. And the overall impression here is that we really see very little difference between the different wavelengths of light. There's a very dramatic response to all these different light sources. So we can answer some of these questions. We can say with some certainty that the response time to lights coming on is less than 5 seconds. The spatial impact of a research ship such as this, which is the Helmer 162 meters long, a converted trawler, stern trawler, is greater than 0.15 square kilometers. The depth of impact is 200 meters, but it's probably more than that because 200 meters was the seabed. And we now believe that light pollution will result in net sampling bias. So possibly many of the papers we've published over the last few years on activity during the polar night might need to be revisited in light of this information. Several papers have come out on this, and if you need any more information, we've got a website for the project, which is going to be running for the next 4 to 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. That was fascinating, really, really interesting. And again, it just highlights how much we're only really just starting to find out, I think. And I would imagine that some of these effects kind of continuously interact with some of the other effects that are happening as well. And that's that just really re-emphasizing the need for interdisciplinary working on some of these issues and on the way we do environmental impact assessments and things like that. Okay, yeah, I'm going to have to move on straight away, but thanks again. Professor Philip Woeke is our next speaker from the University of Stirling.
Thanks very much, Corin. I hope you can hear me.
Yep, can hear you. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Okay, let's see if I can actually get this going in slideshow mode. Okay, so thanks very much for the invite. I really appreciate this. I'm going to break the rules of presentations here and present probably a little bit too much, but I want to paint a picture, if I can, about research collaboration and its importance and how we can foster this. So the context, and thanks very much to Karin for this, she's already said this, the Arctic's huge and it's complex, and it's undergoing very rapid environmental and socio-economic change. So the terrestrial realm alone is 14 million kilometres squared. That's 180 times the land surface area of Scotland. So just to put things into context. So the Arctic is seriously impacted by events occurring further south, and it can be considered a bellwether of change, so an early warning, the canary in the coal mine. And it's a critical component of the Earth system. So events there matter, and there are complex interactions and feedbacks with the planetary system. So that's a little bit of the background. And international scientific cooperation actually in the Arctic is pretty well established in some areas. So I'll just give you a few examples here. So we've got the Arctic Council, part of that, the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, the International Arctic Science Committee, the European Polar Board, Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, and I know Isabel would have been involved heavily with that, Interact, EU Transnational Access, and programs, particular community-led initiatives like the International Tundra Experiment. And I'm going to touch on the latter through the presentation. So, but just to give you a flavour of what's already out there, we have from the Arctic Council, one of their working groups here is the AMAP, so Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme, with many, many different syntheses available, all really initiated before major concerns about Arctic amplification of global warming and issues like this. So that's an important one. There's lots and lots of information there, lots of reports like this one, published in 2018. And linked as well to Arctic Council, we have CAF, so the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, and they have produced the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, which if you've not managed to find that, it's all available online, and there's some really, really nice work presented there. Really nice imagery here, iconic in terms of Arctic species here, the Arctic fox, which obviously is in serious decline, for example, in mainland Scandinavia, probably being outcompeted by red foxes. A characteristic here of biodiversity change, the Arctic specialists in particular are under threat. And of course, what's going on, what's giving impetus for our research and our interest here is change. And the Arctic amplification is very well established now. 2020 is tied with 2016, warmest years on record. So this gives us real impetus. So when we think about approaches to science in the Arctic, certainly coordinated international research efforts, these have led to a step change in our ability to understand, model and upscale responses of Arctic ecosystems to change. In this regard, Scotland-based scientists are strongly involved in or leading some of the key initiatives, several of which have been running for decades, for example, the International Tundra Experiment that I've mentioned. There does remain, however, a critically important role for targeted process and mechanistic research. So really boots on the ground are still really important. We can't do everything through remote sensing. So just to give you a flavour here of ITEX, a community-led international programme here, formally started in 1990, but before that, here are some of the actual research sites. So Barrow in Alaska, Isabel will recognise these sites, and also Ingersvoll Jonsdottir's son, there on the right-hand side as well, in Aðalskildheiði and Þingvellir in Iceland. My own introduction to work in the Arctic for real was up in Ny-Ålesund, that Sarah's already mentioned, in Svalbard in 1991. But I'd already been almost in the Arctic in North Iceland in 1983 as an undergraduate. That's me on the left. I'm a bit fatter these days and greyer. And so here's my research site out there. Sarah will recognise this, the opposite side of town, for her experiment here. And looking at the effects of warming, nutrients and water on some of these key Arctic vegetation species. But I'll note we're looking mainly here at vascular plants, and this is an issue, okay? So very, very briefly, in relation to the International Tundra experiment, there's been some amazing large-scale syntheses done from this. And this is the results of one such effort where we've done experimental warming around the Arctic. We see consistently performance is very good for shrub species, so particularly deciduous shrubs. They're the winners when we warm up, and we have the losers of the cryptogams, so the mosses and the lichens in particular. This synthesis was published in 2006 based on, back then, 61 experimental warming studies of up to 24 years duration. And effectively, the results broadly parallel what we measure in nature by satellite and on the ground. And subsequent work has actually consolidated this. This was the first synthesis there, was in 1999, and all the way up to the present day, still using this information and still collecting information. And this is underpinning the PhD research of several generations now of PhD students and cohorts and moving on in the science community. So from my perspective, I was involved in ITEX fairly early on. I chaired it for 7 years. But one of the real questions that I've been looking at subsequently is this whole issue of whether or not a more productive Arctic will store more carbon. This is the general assumption in many cases. And in fact, our own mechanistic work really casts doubt on this particular idea that you have more productive systems sequestering more carbon, because so much carbon is held in the soils, as Sarah alluded to earlier. And when we change productivity and when we change plant functional types as well, often we have cascading effects into things like the mycorrhizal status, so the soil microbial ecology and community type, which can change what actually happens. So, for example, a recent study in Northwest Territories in Canada here, we've been looking at the consequences of carbon fluxes through shrubs and into the ground, and then metabolism by soil organisms. And we find that the species of shrubs are critically important. And certainly where we have dwarf birch, which is the orange coloured plant in the background here, it's the autumn, so it's going into its fall colours already. This basically recycles carbon incredibly quickly, and the mycorrhizas associated with this are brilliant at respiring organic matter and extracting nutrients for the plants. Conversely, when we're dealing with boulder here, there's a whole different set of processes to do with the microbial communities associated with it. So this has been really fun, and we've published a whole series of neat papers related to this. You'll note a name mentioned here, Lorna Street, also mentioned by Sarah. Really, we've produced some counterintuitive results here, very much so. So more productive systems don't necessarily store more carbon because of the interactions with soil organisms. And some of the key candidates here relate to ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they might be the key link between vegetation and carbon storage. So biodiversity really matters in the soil. And related to this, again, this relates to previous comments, we are relatively, we have a good handle on vascular plants and their responses to change, and vertebrates in particular. Once we start actually moving through this pyramid and downwards into cryptogams, including mosses, cyanobacterial crusts, algae, invertebrates, And then microorganisms, we've got increasing uncertainty, but certainly increasing biodiversity associated with this. So this is really important, that we need to actually do more. And I'm guilty of this, spending too much time looking at vascular plants, and we need to understand what's going on in the whole system, including actually the herbivores as well, and we'll hear about that next. So what I want to just finish up by doing is literally, I want to make the point here that community-based initiatives represent a successful model for international research collaboration. This is really important. Transnational access support for early career researchers, especially, but also some of us that aren't quite so early career, this provides excellent value for getting people in the field. Excuse me, that's my alarm. And boots on the ground are still needed. So I really want to emphasize that. So we have, you'll hear it in a moment about the herbivory network, I'm sure. We've got in Scotland Team Shrub, which is now has gathered huge momentum in terms of the Circumpolar Initiative led by Isla Myers-Smith and Edinburgh University. We're linked through to the International Tundra Experiment. And all of these are great. And this is some of the sites that you can now access as an early career researcher or a more established one through the EU Interact Transnational Access Programme. And this is how these sites relate to environmental space in terms of precipitation and temperature. And I would say this is a brilliant example of a successful programme. And it's something certainly in Scotland we should be looking at and looking to enable links to be made between researchers and these opportunities. So with that, I just want to say thanks very much for listening. I'm sorry that I went over ever so slightly there, but thanks a lot. Thanks, Karin.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, and thanks for highlighting as well the kind of existing collaborations that are already there. So they're obviously good to build on and extend into a wider range of disciplines as well. I'm going to move straight on. Isabel, are you ready to take over from Phil?
Yes, I'm good.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me and see my screen? Good. So thanks for the invitation for being here today. I'm going to take it from Phil and talk a little bit about the UArctic thematic network on herbivory, of which I am the lead. So I would like to talk a little bit about the work that we have been doing as a network as an example of how efforts can be coordinated across the Arctic to provide some ideas on how Scotland-based researchers can contribute to Arctic research, as many of you are already doing. So similar to the thematic network on climate justice, our herbivory network as a UArctic thematic network is relatively new. And it was first endorsed by UArctic just a year ago. But this network builds on an ongoing initiative, the Herbivory Network, which is an international network of researchers interested in understanding the role of herbivores in Arctic and alpine ecosystem. And this network was established in 2014, actually following one of the ITEX meetings in that year, and currently involves more than 200 scientists from more than 20 countries. And for us, becoming a thematic network under UArctic has helped consolidate some of our activities and has opened up some other possibilities that were not available before. So our common interest on the role of herbivores in tundra ecosystems is what glues the network together. But just to give you a little bit of context, why do we focus on herbivores in the tundra? So many of you are probably aware that herbivory is a dominant biotic interactions in tundra ecosystems. Herbivores strongly influence the functioning of ecosystems worldwide through their impacts on nutrient cycling, vegetation change, and climate feedbacks. And as well, herbivores are important to many northern communities. Many Arctic herbivores are hunted, like ptarmigan and geese, or herded, like reindeer, or domesticated, like sheep. However, the impacts of herbivores on ecosystems depend on where and when herbivory happens. And this is where we need coordinated efforts to address these questions at a circumpolar scale. And as well, it's important to keep in mind that, as we have been saying throughout the session, that tundra ecosystems are changing very fast in response to ongoing environmental changes. So understanding how herbivory influences these systems will help guide adaptive strategies to preserve their ecosystem services. One of the main goals of the herbivory network is to serve as a platform to facilitate research cooperation. And we have been doing that by promoting the implementation of joint research projects, the organization of scientific meetings and workshops, and the training of students. So one of the core activities of the network is research. And I wanted to give you an idea of the work that we have been doing. And I wanted to mention 3 main projects that we have been working on. So one of the projects looked at patterns of invertebrate herbivory across the tundra. And for this part, we have been closely collaborating with the UArctic thematic network on arthropods of the tundra, NEAT. And this project actually started with the development of a common sampling protocol that many colleagues implemented across sites in the Arctic to collect samples in a consistent way. And based on that sampling exercise, we found that invertebrate herbivory is widespread across the tundra, but it occurs at very low intensity. However, the levels of invertebrate herbivory are likely to increase with warmer temperatures, so we need to keep an eye on them in the future. Another project that we have been working on relates to the drivers of herbivore diversity across the Arctic. And in these 2 studies, we found that across the tundra biome, herbivore diversity is driven primarily by primary productivity, so plant productivity, and the diversity of predators. And this is really interesting because with the ongoing environmental changes that the Arctic is experiencing, we are seeing increases in these 2 drivers. So this will have consequences to the composition of herbivore assemblages and as well to the functioning of tundra ecosystems more broadly. And finally, I wanted to mention some synthesis work that we have been doing. We did a literature review on the complex effects on herbivore trampling on tundra soils and their implications for plant soil feedbacks. And as well, we are currently using a systematic map to see where and when herbivory has been studied in the Arctic. And one of our main findings so far, and because this is something that we are working on right now, is that actually there is a lack of studies on the effects of herbivores in areas that are changing the most or the least in response to climate change. So we do have an incomplete picture of what the effects of herbivores are in the areas that are responding more strongly to climate change and those that are more resilient to changes. So one of the effective ways of promoting these collaborations has been through the organization of workshops and meetings when it was still possible to meet in person. So we have organized these meetings as part of larger conferences that we were otherwise attending, but we have also had some specific herbivory network meetings like this one that we organized in Iceland in 2016. And as well, many herbivory network members are active faculty members that are teaching and mentoring students. So we see a great potential in joining efforts to offer students possibilities for learning about Arctic herbivory through, for example, the development of field courses and online materials. So, for example, we have had already 3 master students graduated that had done their research on work related to herbivory network projects. And we now have 2 ongoing PhD students. And as well, we have developed a short open online course, Sheep in the Land of Fire and Ice, that deals with the impacts of sheep grazing in Iceland. And this is freely available on the edX platform if you're curious about it. And what lies ahead of us are very exciting times. We are now part of a Horizon 2020 project called Charter, Drivers and Feedbacks of Changes in Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity, which is led by Professor Bruce Forbes at the University of Lapland. And we recently got funding from the Icelandic Research Fund for a project called Tundra Salad, which looks at the impacts of herbivore diversity on tundra ecosystems. So this will keep us busy for the next little while. And before I finish, I wanted to say that it is me presenting here today, but there are several of us who are contact persons at UArctic member institutions. And of course, behind this initiative, there is a much larger group of people who actually make this a real network. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Isabel. That's great, and thanks for ending on a forward-looking note, which provides the perfect transition to the discussion